Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my 2025 World Championships Swiss Stage Day number 6 overview and analysis video. We've had a couple of days of a break in between the last couple games and the, introduction to the 2-1 and 1-2 stage here to the permanent best of threes from here on out, at least for the rest of Swiss Stage, but still a lot of things to talk about today. Again, as we kind of just stated at the beginning here, we are in the permanent best of 3 stage, which means 2 best of 3s per day, I believe, from here on out. There might be 3 on the final day. I don't exactly know what the format is going to be there. I forgot to check going into this, but at the very least, we have 2 best of 3s here today to talk about. They are both in the 2-1 section, which means by the end of this video, we will know the 2 teams or 2 of the teams that are joining anyone's legend, as well as, of course, KT Rolster in the quarterfinals, guaranteeing themselves top 8 at the tournament. And boy, do we have some fun matchups. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from the games that we got? Did they live up to your expectations, or were you perhaps surprised by the outcomes? We've got certainly some of the more passionate fan bases involved in today's games, which means I'm really excited to get to cover who ended up making it out on top. But that's going to kick off with our first series of the day. And our first series was one that I think was a bit more predictable in terms of who was the favorite versus who was the underdog. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LCP in the CTBC Flying Oysters and the number 2 seed from the LCK in Hanwha Life Esports. Of course, HLE are going to be coming in here as favorites just due to the nature of the LCK, but honestly, CFO have looked excellent across this tournament so far. They're coming down from the 2-0 section. They hadn't dropped a series or a game up until that series against anyone's legend, and obviously they aren't able to walk out of that with a win, but they look really good in that series. They're really strong against the team that I would say performed the best throughout the entirety of the Swiss stage in AL, and I think that there are some arguments that, hey, if you don't play rest 3 games in a row, perhaps that series becomes a lot more interesting, because CFO was able to take a game off of AL. If they could get one more, then they'd already be in the quarterfinals, and unfortunately for them, that might have been one of their better shots, because it does not get easier from here on out going up against HLE. They've not looked perfect at this tournament either. They also drop a best of 1, and not a best of 3, but a best of 1 to anyone's legend earlier on in the tournament. They've been able to fight their way back after that 0-1 start to get themselves here to 2-1, but everything looked a little bit off for this team. Zeka was not stacking his tier. You had players like Peanut being way too aggressive. HLE just kind of had a bad vibe, I think, coming out of the summer regular season, and so there were a lot of things that I think were pushing back on hype for HLE, but they're clearly still favorites heading in to a series like this. But CFO have shown over and over again, they have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are going to put up a fight against whoever they go into. That should be no exception here. But as you guys know, the way we do this is go game by game. We talk about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'm giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for every game that we cover. And we're talking about the quarterfinals. We're talking about the upcoming best of 3s at the end. But right now, if we are going game by game, that means we get to start with game number 1 of this great first series. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to pick up the 1-0 series lead here. They're going to pick up a win on red side in game number 1 with CFO, both having the tier advantage, being the number 1 seed from the LCP versus HLE's number 2 seed, and also coming down from the 2-0 section. HLE do not care about that. They want to showcase in this series that they are the better team, and I think at the very least in game number 1, it felt very clear that they were the better execution team. Now, CFO did not lay down and die. They lost a pretty big lead in the early game to just kind of like bad play across the map. Very aggressive play from HLE where they were able to kind of slowly accumulate about a 2k gold lead, but CFO basically stagnated the game entirely from that point onwards and actually ended up trading 3 for 3 or 4 for 3 in a lot of fights that ended up being relatively positive for them overall. I think they ended up playing the back end of this game relatively well, but they dug themselves a little bit too big of a hole, and at some point HLE just needed to win one team fight and the game was going to be over, and that's exactly what happened. That's essentially what happened in this game, is HLE finally win a fight 5-0 or 4-0. I don't think they end up killing Kaiwing, but they take out all of the members who can actually stop the push into the base. They end up teleporting and pushing down mid lane and ending the game. This is a very stereotypical HLE experience. The only thing that I think is interesting that I do kind of want to talk about here is this experiment that I think a lot of teams are going for. There are clearly 2 big power picks, I would say, of this patch or of this World's meta right now. Maybe 3 if you want to include the Scion, but I think that ban kind of is necessary against Driver in particular. But I will say, like, the big power picks right now of this patch are clearly Orianna and Azir. my personal opinion, I've been pretty vocal about this. I think one is significantly stronger than the other. I do not think this is a fair trade of mid laners. I think Orianna is significantly better than Azir. That did not carry through in this game, but so much of that had to do with HongQ's bad early game and the fact that CFO couldn't really play correctly around the Orianna. HongQ was so much more relevant than he had any right to be in this game with the way that he ended up piloting it. We'll talk about that a bit more. Zeka was just better on the Azir as a player, but I think we still saw why Orianna is like the S tier, 1A type of pick on this patch, and we're going to get into that more later in a different series, but for now, you do have to give a big shout out to what was a pretty large mid gap in terms of actual production in this game. Zeka's going to get player of the game for game number 1. Awesome Azir game. Basically every single thing he needed to do mechanically, he was able to get done. We know he's very good at this champion. He was always criticized for not necessarily being a great, late game scaling, non-assassin player, but Azir was always the exception, even if people criticize his champion pool. It's never been towards the part where he's getting criticized for Azir, and the people who are just obviously don't know Zeka. This has always been a critical pick of his in his arsenal, and with Azir being so consistent right now, which is a big reason again why Orianna and Azir are kind of broken on this patch, is because they can fit into almost anything and they're good in basically every circumstance. With Azir being somebody that can really take over the game at any point if you want to play aggressive, Zeka just has the free reign and the ability to kind of move around the map and do whatever he wants. He can dominate a side lane, he can dominate a team fight. He had some awesome picks throughout this game, both in and out of lane. He had some great ultimates in team fights to be able to secure either his own safety in situations that turned bad really quickly, or secure extra kills on primary targets like HongQ in these pivotal fights. Zeka was just excellent in this game. This was the Zeka that was promised in terms of the Worlds buff and the big game player that we were expecting coming into this tournament. Not so much the negatives that we had seen, I would say, over the beginning part of this. It really does feel like Zeka is almost entirely back. Rest of the team was also fine. I think Delight had a really good game on the Rakan, couple of nice engages, I would say overall. Bot lane was really far behind in this game for HLE. Viper was genuinely down like 50, 60 CS at some points in this game, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're playing Yunara Rakan into Ezreal Nami. Credit to Doggo and Kaiwing. We're going to talk about them. They were like the one bright spot, I would say, of CFO consistently throughout this game, but Delight, I think, was still a big impact in the team fights, where I think he was, more important. Zeus had some incredible ultimates with the Rumble, but most of those were so difficult to deal with because of the cataclysms coming in from the Jarvan. No surprise to see Jarvan's win rate kind of balancing out over the past couple of games. I think anybody who just kind of assumed that this champion was going to be bad throughout the rest of the tournament, it's just too small of a sample size, right? We've had such a large sample size over the course of Summer Split. This champion's really not been changed all that much from what Summer was to now, at least in comparison to something like a Pantheon that's, also kind of lost a lot of priority. Jarvan is still a premier pick of the patch, and I'm glad to see that his win rate is kind of bouncing back. He's 3 wins in a row now. I think sitting at 3-10, that is perfectly fine. It's obviously not great, but in a 13-game sample size, which is essentially nothing, like truly the smallest sample size in the universe, obviously Jarvan was going to be fine. And then, of course, the rest of the team played around Zeka very well. So you want to give them credit for their ability to kind of hold on to this game. I think lesser teams might have thrown it away, but HLE was clinical enough that even if they weren't winning every fight, they were able to maintain their gold lead. And for CFO on the other side, how do you screw this one up, man? Like, I hate to say that this should have been a win, but it absolutely should have been a win. Your early game is so much better than HLE's, and all you do is wait around for these late game team fights that you are inevitably going to lose into Rumble, Azir, Yunara. Like, big credit to the bot lane. They did everything that they were supposed to do. Doggo was massive in this game, and he single-handedly kept them in this game. This is the 31-minute game overall, 31 minutes and 22 seconds. This is a 24-minute game without Doggo playing as well as he did on the Ezreal and pumping out damage in team fights. This game just becomes really hard, and obviously credit to Doggo for stepping up and arguably being even better than Viper in this game. I think that that's a fair thing to say for him. And credit to Kaiwing, I think, as well, who also team fought incredibly successfully. I think the bot lane was really excellent, but the rest of this team was just completely useless. I mean, Junjia was constantly diving in without really any priority target to go on because there was so much peel on HLE. That's what happens if you end up going behind on the Xin Zhao in the early game, especially when you're playing off of something like Ezreal Nami. Driver was constantly getting caught in side lanes, and anytime he would go all out, he would instantly die in a team fight because he just didn't really have the tank stats to be able to survive. I'm not saying the Scion Merchant comes through again, but it certainly is a concerning trend right now. And specifically for me, I think HongQ is terrible in this game. He's getting dead of the game for me. I think his positioning, his wave management, his ability to survive in team fights, like all of it, it was just not good. I think he was bailed out in a lot of these scenarios by the fact that Orianna is just going to be good no matter what. Like, she is going to be the strongest champion in the game. In the late game, there is nothing you can do to stop stop it. There is like legitimately no counterplay to that right now because all you have to do is hit one shockwave and all of a sudden the game is entirely over. You have free shields for all of your frontliners. Like, she's just going to be strong and useful. If Hanwha was showing up to any of these fights with mana, or especially if he hadn't gone down so much to Zeka in the early game, this game could have been over very quickly. Again, Orianna makes games so difficult to try and play out the later they go, which is why CFO, I think, had such an easy time being able to at least go neutral in these fights, as Doggo was playing really well, and you had Orianna being able to bulk up and kind of beef up this more, I guess, this less good front line alongside the Nami, but it wasn't enough. If Hanwha was, actually a decent player at the Orianna in this game, then maybe things end up turning. It just wasn't the case. Zeka completely outplayed him, and I think that was the big difference here. But again, CFO, I think, showed a lot of heart and a lot of grit in this game, and they certainly showcased that mechanically speaking, there are multiple players on this team that can go toe-to-toe with HLE and can generate leads in the same way that any other top team in the world can. The question is now, can they translate that to a win in game number 2? Because HLE always felt like they were being tested, but they never really felt like they were behind or in danger at any point in this game. And of course, you have to win a game in order to keep this series alive in a best of 3. So the question now is, HLE going to pick up a win and a sweep here in game 2, just being the better team and getting themselves to the quarterfinals, or will CFO be able to bounce back and tie things up, sending us to a game 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to take this series 2-0, and they will be punching their ticket to the quarterfinals of Worlds in 2025. Unfortunately for the Oysters, this is now the second qualification series in a row that they have lost, which means that they go all the way from 2-0 to 2-2 as they get one more shot in a best of 3 to see if they can get themselves into the quarterfinals to really buck the trend for a region that they have represented so well over the course of this year. They once again really push HLE to their own limits. It really did feel like they were just going to run away with this game, because you wouldn't really look at the Trundle Rise Ziggs comp and say like, oh yeah, you get outscaled incredibly heavily. When they get a 2.5k gold lead really early on into this game, and when they're the ones that are playing proactive, it feels pretty certain that this game is, or that the series is going to a game number 3. But HLE with Vi, Talia, Rek'Sai, Caitlyn, they end up just outscaling. They end up just out team fighting, and eventually they get to the point where their hands are simply just better, and they end up playing the game a bit better, where they end up taking it. So credit to HLE. You want to give them a lot of praise for being able to take this series and, be able to get themselves into quarterfinals. Do they look perfect just yet? No, not quite yet. I still think there's like a gear that's missing, maybe from like the best form that we've seen from them throughout a lot of this year, where it just kind of feels like they're not necessarily winning games as aggressively as they used to. Maybe they just have this, idea that they don't necessarily need to dominate the early game. Do you get away with a game like this against a better team than CFO, like a genuine top 4 or 5 team? Like if you're playing Top Esports or Gen G in a matchup like this, and I know a lot of people hated that I said Top Esports was better than HLE. Bare minimum, they're both top 5 teams right now in terms of how things are breaking down. So if you're playing against those like upper echelon teams, even like a BLG that's been struggling at, or T1 that's been struggling at this tournament, like, do HLE win this game? No, they don't, right? Like, it's just, it's tough. It's tough to say, like, I feel great about it, because I just don't know how well this translates against competition that would actually put up more of a fight when you can't just completely hands check them. But, HLE come out with a win, and that's kind of what you're looking for. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Viper, for me, is going to get player of the game for game 2. He was untouched in basically every team fight at the end of this game. The thing we always talk about with Caitlyn on this channel is that she really does have a bit of like a V graph in terms of just how good she is at any part of the game. She's obviously incredibly oppressive in the 2v2 early on because of her range and her sheer amount of base damage that she's able to output. Everybody knows that lane Caitlyn is incredibly dominant and will likely be a threat to take first tower, even against something like Ziggs, although Ziggs, a relatively okay answer to that, I would say, all things considered. But what a lot of people don't remember about Caitlyn is that even though she does dip off after the early game, it kind of comes back around 4-3-ish items, like 3 and 3.5-ish items, where she ends up becoming a lot stronger, and all of a sudden, like, her late game carry potential actually does kind of go through the roof if you do want to play front to back, because her range, and again, her baseline damage is just so high. As a crit marksman, especially right now with a lot of the crit changes, she is very, very good in the later parts of the game, and is likely going to output more consistent damage than anybody else on the side of CFO. And so if you let Viper go untouched in basically every single one of these fights, yeah, he's going to tear you apart in the 5v5. So once he does hit that 3rd and 4th item, even if he's not going to be the strongest in the mid game, where HLE, quite frankly, just kind of fell apart. They didn't really have a very good mid game, which is not great to say with Vi and Talia as your mid jungle duo, but I'm certainly not blaming Zeka for that, because while Viper might be player of the game for game number 2, player of the series as a whole is definitely going to Zeka in the mid lane. he was easily the best player across both of these games. I don't think Viper was very good in game number 1. I think he got mega outplayed in the 2v2 in a matchup that obviously isn't ideal, but the Yunara was basically a passenger in that game number 1, didn't really have to do a whole ton. While Viper did step up here in game number 2 and in my opinion was the most relevant player on the Rift, I think Zeka certainly had the biggest impact on both of these games. Hanwha was not very good. I think across this entire series, I think he had a lot of struggles at being able to maintain his own tempo, and I think his positioning in team fights was exploited very consistently. He just was not able to output all that much damage in comparison to maybe what you would want out of your Ryze right now in the meta, just purely because of how much Zeka was pressuring him out and some mistakes that Hanwha was making. But you got to give Zeka credit in that regard as well. How many shoves did this guy hit throughout this entire game? Every wall was pertinent and important and actually game-changing. You know, there were multiple times where, you know, even the E coming out from Talia completely changed how CFO wanted to play a fight. He bursted Rest down at the beginning of the final ascent here, like when they caught him mid lane to the Nexus, like when they were pushing through the middle of the map with that Baron buff. Like, Zeka made play after play after play. I think Viper was more important because I think his damage coming through was why those Zeka plays mattered, but Zeka was the one making those plays. He was the playmaker for the team, and he looked a lot better in this series than he really did at any other point in this tournament. This is what you need to see out of Zeka. Hopefully he can continue this. You know, Peanut, Zeus, Delight, obviously, you know, you're excited for Peanut being able to get back into the quarterfinals. If there was ever any doubt that that was going to happen, that would have been a concern in the first place, but, you know, in his last hurrah, his last dance here at Worlds, he does get the opportunity to once again go into a best of 5 and, you know, try and push his way back to the finals. You know, he's obviously on that big retirement tour right now. This is his last chance to ever go and win Worlds, and he hasn't been to World Finals, I believe, since 2017. I think that was the last time, and I think the only time, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that he was in World Finals, of course, with SKT losing to that Samsung Galaxy team in 2017. He obviously is one of the most legendary, if not the most legendary jungler of all time. At this point, certainly made a case to be the greatest jungler of all time with the sheer amount of LCK titles and domestic success he's been able to gather over the course of his career. But the World Championship has always been the thing that's eluded him, and now he gets another shot. Some great ultimates on the Vi throughout this game to set that up. Zeus was inting for most of this game on the Rek'Sai, had multiple moments where Junjia just completely outplayed him and really kind of, you know, put him in a bad position, was targeted a lot in the early game. But at the end of the day, it does not matter how much you take Rek'Sai out of the game. You get one good fight off, and that's enough gold to make this champion useful throughout the back end. You know, Zeus was not perfect, but he didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be relevant, and he was exactly that. And then, of course, Delight had some nice engages on the Alistar as well. I think that third dragon fight was really just completely won by Delight. So credit to HLE. I mean, they look like a well-oiled machine right now in terms of how they are operating, what we expected to see out of them coming to the World Championships. Maybe there are some small things to clean up. I still want to see their early games get better because I just think that is very exploitable by the best teams in the world right now when you're talking about trying to win the entire tournament. But it's clear that they have incredible hands and that is likely good enough to be able to carry them through even some rough patches early on. And then for CFO on the other side, pretty disappointing loss here. I think you really wanted to take a game and it just didn't really happen. It's clear that this team actually really struggles without Sion in the top lane. I'm not going to say that is entirely the issue here for CFO, but playing around anything else, like that inconsistent front line that you get with basically any other setup that isn't Sion, just seems to be more difficult for even kind of the other members of this team that aren't top lane, like Junji and Hanwha, I think have played worse without the Sion because they don't have that consistent setup that they can play really aggressive around. That's not to say this team is terrible, just that I think they needed to play better in this series. Hanwha in particular, I just do not think was very good here today. Don't let his KDA fool you. This guy did absolutely nothing that you need to be doing as Ryze throughout a majority of this game. Some of the realm warps were okay. I'm not going to sit here and say that he completely threw the game away with those. I think he was generally fine with the way that he was maneuvering around the map. I think he could have been more aggressive, but really, I mean, in terms of damage output in these team fights, he was getting out damaged by Talia, you know, definitely out damaged by the Caitlyn. It didn't really feel like he ever had a massive impact, and Hanwha also wasn't particularly safe throughout a majority of these games. He was getting caught out way too far forward. Just was not a great day overall for Hanwha, and I think Zeka was absolutely the better mid laner. That was probably the biggest difference maker, I would say, between these two teams when CFO was able to generate some leads for themselves in this series. But I also think there's got to be some frustration with, like, oh, Doggo pops off in game number 1 on the Ezreal and, like, actually has a chance to be able to carry. Let's give him Ziggs for game number 2. I'm not necessarily a part of that. I think the Ziggs was massive in this game at being able to generate that lead that they got in the early game. I think he pressured side lanes very well. I think his damage in team fights was super consistent. I just don't think he ever really had the chance to 1v9, and maybe you do want that out of the player that right now is playing the best for CFO at this tournament. You know, Rest comes back in. He plays the Renekton on the top side. There are times where he's okay, times where he's not. He gets caught and loses the game for his team, but the game was probably already over at that point. Junjia was fine, but again, lost tempo. I think was could have afforded to be a bit more aggressive, especially in the late game once they already had their lead. Kaiwing found some really nice engages, but again, Leona can't carry the game. It just kind of felt like CFO never had the firepower to keep up with HLE. Even when they had a gold lead, it never really felt like they were safe from throwing it because their hands just aren't quite as good as Hanwha Life. And I do think that there is an inherent upside to CFO. It's been awesome to see them really shock a lot of people and be as good as they've been throughout this tournament up until this point, but qualification is not guaranteed. They go into the 2-2 section, and there are a lot of opponents in that phase that would be very difficult for them to beat in a best of 3. I think obviously they have the opportunity and the potential to draw a team that they would be favored against, and they also have the opportunity to be underdogs and still win a series, but need to see more out of this team, especially in the late game after this. And for HLE, they're lucky to get to the quarterfinals on this game, but certainly not lucky to be there in general. This team was expected to be top 8 at this tournament, bare minimum, and I think really the expectation for them is to compete to win the entire thing. They were number 3 in my pre-tournament power rankings. They've not necessarily lived up to that in terms of their performances, but I absolutely think they can get there by the end of the tournament. But that's going to bring us to our second series of the day, and this is the big one. This is the regional rivalry that is going to determine everything. Every narrative that exists over the next 12 months is going to be entirely decided by this best of 3. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports and the number 1 seed from the LTA in FlyQuest. Every Western conversation, every single one of them will be decided today. Like, it's crazy how much this series actually means for both of these teams. Not only does the winner immediately qualify for the quarterfinals as a 3-1 team, which really proves that at the very least they can hang at the international level, but more importantly, this kind of determines who the best team in the West is, like full stop. Obviously, FlyQuest has held that title, I would say, throughout this year, especially with the 3-0 over G2 at MSI, but G2 has only gotten better throughout the year. It is unfair to compare this version of G2 to their counterparts at MSI that ended up, losing all 3 games against FlyQuest. Undoubtedly, they are better, and I talked going into this series about how, I think it's fair to say FlyQuest are solid favorites in this series, but it's certainly not like a runaway kind of thing. I would say it's about 60-40. I think you definitely have to consider Fly favorites, not only because they already beat G2, but because I think while, they're very slow, their biggest weakness is that you can take advantage of them in the early game with really good laners. G2 is also very slow. Like, these might be the 2 slowest teams in the entire tournament, to be entirely frank, and I just worry a bit about matchup-wise whether that's going to be good enough into a team like Fly that's just going to have more clinical execution in the mid to late game, or what they've shown to be more clinical execution. I've also been very critical so far of G2's run at this tournament. Despite playing some really good teams and certainly a harder schedule than Fly, G2 has not really shown a lot of those improvements that they had in the regular season and domestically here at Worlds so far, especially in the early game, where I think while Skewmond is going for more plays than maybe he was at the beginning of the year, it certainly doesn't feel like I would classify him as an actual aggressive jungler that wants to try to win the game off of tempo and pressure. They're hoping and praying to go neutral in the early game and win late game team fights. Lucky for them, FlyQuest also likes that strategy. I just favor Fly a little bit more in terms of their execution, but again, I think G2 is clearly the second best Western team at this tournament in terms of expectation, and with this win, they would no doubt be the best Western team at this tournament. There is so much on the line for both of these regions. The LEC has not made the quarterfinals since, I believe, 2022, and of course, NA has been the region to take a lot of those spots in the previous years, even with G2 likely being the best Western team in both 2023 and 2024. Can they get their revenge? Well, the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting off with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this is your prototypical FlyQuest game. Like, they would not ask for anything other than what this was, which was incredibly slow, very methodical, and just suffocating for G2. I don't want to sit here and say that Fly plays like a Korean team, but they play like the stereotypical Korean team, right? Like, I think Korea, ironically enough, has sped up really outside of Gen G, who are also still very good at this style. Fly is like Gen G's little brother in terms of the way that they end up wanting to execute a lot of the games that they play, where they are totally fine going completely neutral in the early game and just getting small leads here and there and being able to pick up a kill or 2 every once in a while, be able to get small gold leads because their hands are pretty strong and their macro is incredibly good. I think they're one of the best macro teams at this tournament, and that's exactly what happened here, is they just kind of picked apart G2, got like a 1k gold lead, a 2k gold lead, a 3k gold lead, and then they get Baron and the game is over, right? Like, it doesn't have to be this gigantic slugfest for Fly. They would actually prefer that it's not. For G2, The thing that scares me is that I think they also really like that style. Like, they are the kind of team, especially with a draft like this, playing through Maokai Victor as your mid-jungle duo, that really wants to try and play for the late game, that wants to try to 5v5, but they were constantly getting caught in side lanes, or at least Caps was constantly getting caught in side lanes, and then they had some terrible execution in these fights from some of their key players that, were getting better over the course of the domestic regular season that did not show up in this game number 1, at the very least. We'll need to see if they can change that for the rest of the series. But player of the game for game 1 is going to go to Inspired in the jungle. Would feel kind of difficult to go in any other direction here in terms of player of the game. Inspired was excellent, a complete jungle masterclass against Skumond here, who, Maokai was the champion this team found a ton of success on at the beginning of the year when you're talking about the only things they could consistently win with. Maokai was really that piece for G2. Inspired showcased why that style was never going to be particularly consistent or successful because, this Maokai had no presence on the map. I know we talk about tempo as this ubiquitous concept a lot, and I've been bringing it up a lot more in the modern videos, kind of explaining what I mean when I talk about tempo, but it's getting to make your turn first. And G2, and Skumond in particular in this game, basically said, I don't want any tempo. You can make whatever moves you want, and then I will react to you. Well, unfortunately, Inspired is going to pick the right moves to make. He's not going to make mistakes in terms of taking his turns, and that's exactly what happened. This Wukong was everywhere on the map. Every objective, every single major, skirmish or gank or fight, in the late game, like, Inspired was a critical key piece of it, and Skumond just never really felt like he had that same kind of pressure. Are there things Inspired could have done better? Maybe you even play more aggressive in the early game because you're Wukong Talia, but I think generally speaking, you counted on your ability to take the gold lead that you had generated and utilize that in the late game, because G2 was basically giving you a 2k gold lead throughout this, and Inspired did more than enough to be able to win with it. I think it's fair to say that Busio was also, incredible, and that's kind of the recurring trend here for FlyQuest, is that when Inspired and Busio play well, this team wins. When they don't play well, they lose, and Busio, I think, really stepped up on the Oyster here in game number 1. Masu was fine. The Corki damage was there. Like, I don't think he did anything exceptional. I don't even think his damage was all that high, but he existed in the fights and he didn't die. Bwipo had some really nice moments zoning off basically the entirety of G2. Really nice plays overall. I think he actually is a bit underrated for his performance. I think he was really good here in game number 1. And Quad, while he continues to get caught in bad situations and be too far forward and not always maximize his damage, at the very least, he was able to be more relevant and catch out other members like Caps in some pretty key situations. So for Fly, a very FlyQuest game number 1, like basically exactly how they would want to win, and they got it here. And then for G2, the big concern here, right, and the big reason why I've been lower on G2's run and why I've always kind of pushed back on their, hype at this tournament up until this point is, man, their early games are just nothing. Like, they just do not try to make any plays happen, and I think it really came back to bite them. I mean, this is the prototypical example of do nothing and lose. Like, they have to be better than this going into game 2. I have confidence that they have the skill level to be able to do that, but the big problem here is that you have a couple of players, or I guess one player on a champion that he's not particularly comfortable on in Labrov, taking away this Bard. This Bard was clearly a takeaway more than it was an actual pick for Labrov, because he's been terrible at Bard all year long. You have Caps on something that's perma-dove in the early game on this Victor, and obviously you can take advantage of that champion, but Caps also getting caught kind of really decreases G2's chances, and that means that Skumond can't play the game, because pretty much every time that Skumond has played aggressive, it's been because Caps has free pressure, either in mid lane or in a side lane that he can play through. When Caps loses, this team just does not know what to do. In the early and in the mid game, they completely fall apart in terms of the way that they play the map, and so a lot of things kind of need to change, but I think mentality-wise, like, is it a concern for G2? Absolutely. Like, this is a majorly concerning trait, that it just doesn't seem like they even have a remotely adequate early game, especially if things don't go the one way that they've learned how to play the game domestically and been able to dominate domestically. But like I said, Labrov is going to get dud of the game for me. I think he was clearly the most uncomfortable on the Bard. Basically zero proactive plays this game, and I think you can say the same for obviously the rest of the team, but it's kind of his job on the Bard to be the one to be the proactive playmaker in this comp. We can, lambast Skumond for being super passive and doing nothing and sitting there and just going down 2k gold into the Wukong the entire game and not really play at all, but at the end of the day, he's Maokai and his team's not doing particularly great. Like, there is some sort of explanation of, well, we can scale and hope we win late, and just kind of hope and pray that things turn around. For Labrov, there is no excuse. You can't really ever play this safe and passive on the Bard. He didn't feel confident in the way that he was making plays, and when he did make plays, they were bad plays. So just not a good game overall from him on the Bard. It, again, very much felt like a takeaway rather than an actual pick. Caps was terrible in this game, was constantly getting caught in side lanes, was, bleeding gold, and really had a consequential death around that Baron take that ended up really throwing the game away for G2. Not that it already wasn't in a terrible spot, but that completely ended it. Like, really no chance to win it. Caps needs to be on something more proactive than the Victor. That's become very clear. Skewmon, we already kind of talked about being very behind. Broken Blade and Hans were here as well. I don't think they necessarily were great or bad. I think they were just kind of along for the ride, but G2 suffering from the same problems they have all year long. No early game. They have to change this going into game number 2, but Fly certainly feels like they've found their own formula. They've gotten back into form, beating some gimme teams earlier on into in the tournament. If they are going to be able to close this out in 2, that's going to be massive for the narrative and massive for their chances forward in this tournament. But for G2, they have more than enough skill to be able to pick up a win. They just need to set themselves up into a game state where they can actually start to play through it. So are they going to be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and we are going to a deciding game number 3 between these two teams. Could you ask for anything more than a game 3, than a do or die final game to really kind of determine who the best in the West is? G2 fighting back in game number 2, and you know what? Finally, man, absolutely brilliant early game from G2. They do everything that they need to do. They play proactive, they play smart, they're capitalizing on mistakes. Where has this been over the course of this tournament? There were flashes of this, and I would say, probably 70-ish% of their games domestically, ended up like this by the end of the year, but we've not really seen this version of G2 at Worlds up until this point. Skewmon was super aggressive on the Trundle. He ended up getting very accelerated. 2 free kills on the top side of the map early on in this game because of the counter matchup with Broken Blade into Bwipo, and then Caps just being able to outplay Quad. Everything gets so simplified when all of that pressure that you're giving for free over to FlyQuest throughout game number 1 gets transferred to you because you're the one making proactive plays. And for Fly on the other side, everyone's going to critique the Soraka, and I think that there is some criticism of, like, why are you pulling out Soraka when you are 1 game away from the quarterfinals? Like, is this not is there a different time for you to pull out this champion and kind of see if it works? But honestly, the Soraka was clearly the best part of this comp throughout this entire game. You had massive problems coming in with your main carries, and especially your solo laners, who I think were so weak in this game that it ended up being basically unplayable from a damage perspective down the stretch. I think this draft is completely unacceptable from Fly in this instance, and we'll go into that a bit more. But for G2, what a masterclass at the start of this game at being able to generate your own tempo and your own resources. This is how you beat FlyQuest. You want to talk about Fly getting to play their comfort zone and getting to play the exact kind of game that they feel really comfortable on in game number 1. Well, here's a game number 2 where, G2 say, maybe we shouldn't just let them scale and get these small leads everywhere on the map, let them trade whatever objective that they want. If they want Dragon, we'll take Grubs. It doesn't really matter. We're not going to make plays with them anyways. Like, yes, pressure them out, like force them to react to you and force them to kind of step up and do something to the plays that you are making. That's what T1 did to them at the beginning of this tournament. Inspired looked terrible in that game. Busio looked terrible in that game. And here's G2 saying, all right, well, it's clear we can't scale. Let's throw down the gauntlet in the early game. Let's do something we haven't really done at this tournament and just be really aggro, looking for ganks and pressure all the time. And guess what? Fly had no answer. They had no response. Skewmon deserves a ton of credit for that. And if you want to give him player of the game, I totally understand. He was excellent in this game, but Caps also deserves a ridiculous amount of credit for that in the mid lane as well. I think his laning ability in this game is really what seals everything, because I think there is a part of this team comp that can be tricky to execute in the later part of the game if you don't have that damage coming in from the Aurora. But Caps being able to not only recover what was an early deficit against the Annie, but be able to really start outpacing Quad by the end of the game in terms of resources and side lane pressure, like, it just completely tears apart Fly's only chance to get back into the game. Caps was phenomenal. This was very much the collapse that we remember, and his damage in team fights was absolutely ridiculous by the end of the game. But again, I think Skewmon's early game really is what set the tempo, and I think he more than earned a player of the game nod if you did want to end up giving it to him on the Trundle. This jungle mid duo was simply better than Inspired and Quad on the other side. That is their avenue and their pathway to success, and they found that here in this game. Broken Blade, I think, also deserves a ton of credit on the Galio. Of course, this is a counter pick. Like, it's not like, oh, Broken Blade had the hardest lane matchup and he won it anyways. Like, this is obviously the pick into Rumble, generally speaking. But to be able to set up these ganks consistently and to be able to hold wave states in positions where Bwipo either had to sacrifice his own game by giving over a ridiculous amount of resources or die to Skewmon, like forcing him into those decisions. Like, Broken Blade was excellent in lane. He was great out of lane. The Galio was just very valuable in this game. I think typically you don't necessarily think of, like, Broken Blade being being on a more, I don't want to say like psychological champion like the Galio, but certainly one that requires a bit more manipulation of the enemy rather than, proactive plays unless you're like super far ahead, at least from the top side of the map. But Broken Blade was excellent at being able to really tear Bwipo apart in this game. Hans and Labrov were good as well. Hans was able to dodge out of a lot of aggressive plays from Fly because they wanted to try and get Masu in this game, and we'll talk about that. But G2 for the most part were better. Jungle mid was certainly better. Top lane was better, and I think that was enough to win them the game. For Fly, I think my biggest problem with this draft, again, I'm actually not going to criticize the Soraka. The Soraka looked OP in this game, quite frankly. There were so many fights that if they had played it remotely from neutral or if they had any damage whatsoever, they would have instantly won it because the Soraka would have made their front line unkillable. And I even really like the Xin Zhao Soraka as like your B1, B5 combo to really kind of make this, big death ball comp where you're healing up Xin Zhao permanently. The problem for me is Annie Lucian as your carry duo coming out of mid and AD carry. You need damage somewhere in this comp because the problem ended up being that you were permanently healing Xin Zhao. Great, like he was taking so long to die in fights, and for what? You weren't trading anything back. Bwipo missed every single one of his ultimates. Annie was set behind in the early game, and now you're relying on Lucian damage to out damage out an Aurora and an Azaya on the other side. It's just never going to happen. I think if you had a more aggressive AD carry in this game, maybe not in terms of positioning, but in terms of damage, like if you had a hyper carry in the AD carry role for this one, I absolutely think that there is an avenue for you to be able to pick up a win here. But because you have Lucian, because you have Annie, especially for Quad, a player who is notorious for not being able to win on this champion, you just don't really have any lane to actually play through other than Inspired, who didn't have the resources early to actually play the game. It's a very bad draft from FlyQuest. I'm stunned that anyone greenlit this when they're one game away from the quarterfinals. This is a contender and probably a front runner alongside that T1 versus Gen G draft for being the single worst draft of the entire tournament up until this point. Like, it is horrible, and I'm not the guy, like, you guys know me, I hate calling draft gap. I never like to talk about draft gap, but this is just one of those games that, like, you either have to completely stomp early or it's unplayable. Bwipo is obvious for dead of the game. I mean, are you going to talk about this guy's positioning in any, considerable way? Like, holy man, this guy was constantly dying in side lanes, especially early on, where he was essentially saying, I don't want to give up my wave, I'm just going to die, even though I know Scumon's on the top side and that I will get punished for stepping up to this wave. And then in the late game, this guy maybe hit one person with an equalizer. I truly have not seen Rumble ultimates go that wide in quite a long time. A terrible, terrible performance from Bwipo. And the sad part is, like, his macro was still good in this game. They were able to get Otacon in this game because of Bwipo's tempo and pressure that he was able to generate. If he was, like, remotely okay in team fights, maybe things end up changing here. But again, like, Fly has better macro. It just doesn't matter if you're giving yourself this big of a disadvantage. Quad, I mean, you want me to, like, rip into Quad's Annie? Like, I'll do it for hours. Why are we still picking it for this guy? He cannot play this champ. He cannot do it at a baseline level. He has never once looked competent on this champion. In the biggest of moments, you say Quad Annie, like, I'm just losing my mind because I think this is one of the most brainless things that they could have possibly gone for. And yeah, Quad looked irrelevant. You needed more damage in this comp and you gave him a champion he's bad at? Great, awesome. Like, oh, you needed more setup. I guess you did need more CC, but maybe that's because you picked, Rumble and Soraka. Like, I don't know, man. It feels like everything just led into FlyQuest going against all of the things they're actually good at. Inspired never really got to play the game because he had to do all the damage and do all the frontlining, and he couldn't do both. Like, even with Soraka heals, he was never going to be able to 1v9 this game. Masu was, dodging and dashing and dancing all over G2, and he played really well in terms of his positioning, but he had 0 damage in these team fights to actually be able to win it. Like, it was cooked for Fly coming out of draft, and I think they need to change things up going into game 3. The only lucky thing is that they can't draft anything like this. Again, no more Annie, no more Soraka. Just get back to the things you're actually good at. For G2, though, the big selling point from game number 2 is you actually won the early game. Not only did you win, you played aggressive and you took control of the early game. If they can do that again in game number 3, it might not matter what FlyQuest ends up drafting. So we'll see how that ends up playing out. The only way to know who's going to be punching their ticket to the quarterfinals and who will be cementing themselves as the best team in the West is to go over game 3. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 3 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series 2-1, and they're going to pull off what I consider to be at least a decent upset. I don't think they necessarily were major underdogs or anything like that. We've certainly had bigger, underdogs in this tournament in terms of matchups, but I don't think G2 were favorites coming into this, and what they did here today is ginormous. I cannot overstate how important this is, not only for G2 as a team, and not only for Fly as a team and NA, NA as a region, which we will talk about, but for EU, for the LEC, what this team has done to get this region back into the quarterfinals after years of missing it, for G2 to be a team that's really led the charge in terms of teams in the West and not be able to capitalize on that at the World Championships, for that to finally come to fruition this year. Man, that's gotta feel good, because they've gotten so close year after year after year. You have to remember, like, yes, Skuma and Labrov, it's their first time in quarterfinals. This is Broken Blade's first time ever qualifying for the quarterfinals of the World Championships in any situation. This guy was not on the team when they did it last, which was, of course, 2021. 2022, it was Rogue that ends up making it. Actually, they don't even make it in 2021. It was 2020, the last time this organization made the quarterfinals. In 2022, when he joined, Rogue makes quarterfinals. In 23 and 24, they lose to Energy, they lose to Billy Gaming, they get shut out of their ability to make quarterfinals. Like, it is crazy how down this team has been at Worlds. This is the first time in half a decade that G2 has been able to make it out of either the groups or the Swiss stage. You just have to be excited for this org and for this team. But for FlyQuest, man, like, I'm gonna be honest, I can't justify this loss. Like, I was on record saying in my primer, okay, I mean, the gauntlet's been thrown by FlyQuest. They either make the quarterfinals bare minimum this year, or everything was for nothing, and I think NA is going to be in trouble moving forward. This is the kind of loss that I think, I'm not gonna try and, panic or freak out. I'm not trying to, be a doomsayer. This is the kind of loss that I worry could, like, kill the region in terms of momentum, because if there was ever going to be a team that had actual buzz and actual hype from North America, it was going to be this FlyQuest team. If they can't beat G2, if they can't even make the quarterfinals, like, what do you even do with this region as a whole? And, we'll talk about it. They had the ability to win this game, and they screwed it up, and they screwed it up even before the game started. I'm going to give you guys a spoiler alert for what I'm the most passionate about coming out of this. I'm serious, and I want to make this clear. If you think under any circumstance, in any situation, in any possible universe, that trading Azir on B1 for Orianna on R1 is a fair and balanced trade for you, you deserve to lose your job as a coach. Like, I'm sorry, like, I can't understand how a reasonable mind would say, all right, we're trading Orianna Azir, I want the Azir. Like how do we get here, man? How does this happen? How are we allowed to do this? This is genuinely, I know I just talked about the Game 2 draft being one of the worst in the tournament. I think this is the worst draft of the entire tournament. No questions asked, mostly because of the situation that it was drafted in, but how in God's name are you leaving Orianna for Caps, of all people, on red side in a do-or-die win game? You have to have just lost your absolute mind. Like, there is no excuse for this to ever happen. And guess what? Caps made you pay. Nothing you did to try and come back in this game mattered, because Caps hit one shockwave, and all of a sudden the game was over. That's what you gave over to G2. You gave the win to G2 Esports, and that's after you did everything you needed to claw your way back. This Azir mattered. Quad was good in this game. Easily the most relevant and most important player on FlyQuest. It did not matter. Caps was more important because he got the better champion, and you have no one to blame but yourselves. This is a disaster class in drafting from FlyQuest, and they deserve to lose this series off of that alone. Their play as well was not very good, but I have to get that out of the way, man, because that is what I'm most passionate about coming out of this game, is that truly, if you are a team at Worlds and you don't think Orianna is pick or ban, you don't deserve to be at Worlds. Like, it just is what it is right now, man. I'm completely tired of this. Like, from neutral, I'm so tired of this. But I guess we can get into it. Caps is player of the game here. Like, how could I possibly go in any other direction? This game looks like it's being completely thrown away. Skewmond runs in and kills himself twice in this game. He throws Baron. He tries to dive after Masu, who's been chunked out for his entire health bar, or Busio, I should say, who's been chunked for his entire health bar, never pops ultimate and just instantly dies. There are multiple plays where Skewmond is just like, you want the game? Here, take it. Like, you are allowed to have it. I don't want to win it on Dr. Mundo. And yet all of it goes away because Caps gets to hit one shockwave and the game is over. Like, it really is that simple. That's not even adding on to the fact that G2 throughout this entire game got to play with a Jax, a Mundo, and a Rel that all had Orianna ball on top of them. All had not only extra, stats obviously from Orianna, but the shielding in general from this champion is as good as any enchanter support in the entire game. You want Nami? Why would you ever pick Nami? You have Orianna, who can also deal damage in the mid game. Like, It's just ridiculous what this champion does, and of course Caps piloted it well. All he had to do was hit one, and he did hit one. He had a couple of pretty nice ultimates this game, but again, the game winner, once FlyQuest end up getting that second Baron, which again, G2 tried their best to throw this game. Skewmod I thought was terrible in the back end of this game. He got player of the series as a whole on that broadcast. I think we were watching different games. Like, this Mundo was so relevant in fights that he was smart enough to play in, but again, like, if they lose this game, it's on Skewmod not pressing ult when he got caught. Like, it truly is that simple. Sometimes, you know, Broken Blade gets destroyed in the early game and ends up completely recovering. Hans and Labrav are always relevant on these two champions, but it's Caps' Orianna that wins them this game. He's player of the game. He's player of the series as a whole. I will not hear anything else about it. And G2 have basically everything to thank on Caps' shoulders for that pick. And honestly, everything to thank on Nuke Duck and Mickey's shoulders and Quad shoulders, whoever ended up signing off on this decision, not only to let Orianna and Azir through draft, because again, you can just ban them. Like, are you really that scared of trading Vi and Jarvan? Like, in this game, is that the fear? Is like, oh, I don't want to trade those two. If the plan was Sejuani anyways, what are you so scared of? What, are they going to take advantage of you in the early game? Just play safe. But, you know, you can't drop one ban for Orianna. Like, we have to just be absolutely trolling here. Let's also look at, and I hate to just continue to belabor the point, if we're going down that pathway, let's say instead of banning the Jarvan on B3, you ban the Orianna. Well, now G2 have a decision to make because they've banned Sion and Yunara. If they ban the Azir to make sure that you don't get that trade over, Nico is now up for Busio, what I would consider to be, outside of Bard, his best champion and something he can break games on. And if they do ban the Nico, then you get Azir without having to trade the Orianna. Like, it is a no-brainer, man. Like, it is actually just so stupid. Like, in every possible avenue. I'm sorry for being so, like, aggressive and passionate about this, but I just am. Like, there is no excuse for drafting like this. This is a potential, like, region-killing draft if everything goes awry, and it's all Fly's fault. But again, credit to Caps. He still had to hit the shockwave, and he did. He was super strong in this game. I just think that Orianna has showcased herself to be as strong as she can be throughout this tournament, regardless of if you play phenomenal. Caps was lucky to have a good game, but like we even saw with Hongq in the previous series, this guy was super useless throughout a majority of this game, was constantly getting targeted, had no mana, was positioning poorly. He still was almost able to salvage that game for CFO, so it just is what it is, man. Like, Orianna's just not a fair champ, especially if you feel like your mid laner is better than the other one, and Caps was able to capitalize. But Bwipo's dead of the game for me. I don't know really what to tell you. He got a gigantic lead in the early game. This guy was up like 2,000 gold, was able to destroy Broken Blade in the 1v1. They capitalized on the Jax multiple times. FlyQuest's entire strategy was to get a bunch of gold on Renekton and then hope to play through the Sejuani Azir combo in the late game, and that kind of worked. Honestly, even with the draft faux pas, FlyQuest had a chance to win this game. They not only get one Baron off of some bad plays coming in from G2, they get two Barons off of some fights that G2 just could not win at the right time. And all of a sudden, the gold is entirely neutral, despite this team being completely dead in the water throughout a majority of it. And what do? They just instantly walk into G2, all die, and the game is over. Like, I just can't comprehend what happened to Fly here. Like, this is one of those games that not only should they have won it, you know, before it started, because, you know, I think you were in a great draft situation before you banned the Jarvan, but you also should have won it twice in game because you were given free passes that you just could not hang on to. Fly should have won, G2 should have lost, and I want to make that clear. I don't feel great about G2 coming out of this series because they probably should have lost Game 3 if they weren't bailed out both by Fly and by this Orianna. But also, it makes me feel worse about the West as a whole because these two teams did not look anywhere close to the kind of gameplay we saw even earlier in the day. HLE and CFO weren't perfect, but boy, they were better than this. I'm sorry to come across very negative. I just feel very passionate about this game and about how it ended up breaking down. Credit to Quad. He played well on the Azir. Hope it was worth it, man. Hope giving up the game-ending shockwave was worth it for your Azir on B1, buddy. Inspired was incredible down the stretch. He was way too passive in the early game because he was playing, you know, Sejuani, and so he couldn't really be the most aggressive version of himself that he could be. But the moment he gets that first Baron, he plays the rest of that game about as flawlessly as you can on the Sejuani. But, I mean, the rest of the team doesn't really help him. This Jhin, I didn't even get started on the Jhin, man. This is also a huge problem. Where is your late game? If you're drafting for Sejuani Azir and you're picking Jhin, you've lost the plot. Like, I'm sorry. I get that things like Xayah that you would normally pair here because they get to stay safe in the early game and still can carry in the late game are gone. But this being Jhin and not I don't know, anything else. I mean, this is a crazy Vayne angle with Jax, Mundo, and Rel on the other side, but like anything else in this AD carry role, like it's just unacceptable. Even with Masu, I think playing both well at certain points and then terrible at other points. Busio was constantly going for engages and just being the sacrificial lamb. Like Fly had this game in their hands. Quad had damage. Masu was, going to be strong enough. They should have still won this game, despite the fact that they threw it away in draft and they still didn't want to win it. The FlyQuest that we have seen all year long is not here. They have not shown up to Worlds. This is the worst version of Fly, and right now, I mean, look at the draws that they could potentially get, even best case scenario. Like, let's reasonably think who is likely to win the rest of the series in both 2-1 and 1-2, who could be opponents for Fly to get into the quarterfinals. They beat one of them, Movistar Koi. Like, that's maybe the only team that's expected to win and wouldn't be an upset that they would actually beat. I think that, even CFO, like, they're probably the closest other team. I wouldn't favor Fly, especially the way they played today against CFO. They would have lost to most teams at this tournament the way they played today. So whatever hype Fly and North America generated for itself, I think unfortunately it kind of came crashing down for a lot of people in this series. But for G2, I tweeted this out. They just 2023 energied FlyQuest, which is very funny. I think there's a lot of fun parallels between those two teams, and obviously, people are going to get mad at me for that because NRG were much bigger underdogs against G2 than G2 were against Fly, and I think it would be disrespectful to say that they were on the same level, but it's so funny how I've been saying all year long that NA and EU switched for 2025, where NA is now the one-team region that just puts all their hopes on the team that should be the best in the West, but the depth is not there, and EU is a bunch of teams that are all competitive domestically, but don't necessarily have the firepower, in my opinion, to be like best in the West territory, only for that region to end up making quarterfinals anyways. It's like the script was literally copied and just flipped over for the other side. I have to be happy for Europe fans because, again, they've been denied this quarterfinals appearance for so long, despite having the best team in the West for G2 in both 2023 and 2024, just getting kind of unlucky in that instance, but they were not going to be denied here. A massive win for G2 that secures not only Europe's dominance, but G2's dominance back at the top as well. All right, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2025 Swiss Stage Day number 6 overview and analysis video. We have two teams that have now officially joined our previous 3-0 teams in qualifying for the quarterfinals. Of course, Anyone's Legend and KT Rolster are there due to their wins in that 3-0, that 2-0 section. They go undefeated, but joining them now, Hanwha Life Esports and G2 Esports to guarantee themselves top 8. Congratulations to half of the competitors that are going to make the quarterfinals. Who's going to be joining them? Well, that's where we get to the rest of this Swiss stage and how it ends up breaking down. We have one more 2-1 matchup to take care of tonight as this video goes live. That's Gen G taking on Top Esports, a very fun matchup. I got in a ton of hot water for saying that Top Esports might be the second best team in this 2-1 stage because everybody thinks that HLE are infinitely better than Top Esports. I think maybe after the CFO series, I think that is a more valid conversation. Before that performance from Zeka, man, there's nothing at this tournament that would suggest that is the case. That's for damn sure. I think Top Esports are being slept on. I think Gen G will still be able to beat them, and I don't think it will be particularly close, but I think that has more to do with Gen G being better than everybody else. Top Esports is a top 5 team at this tournament right now, and even if they move to 2-2, I think they will be just fine. But the 1 and 2 section as well is going to start tonight as well, with Koi taking on Team Secret Whales. This is kind of a big one. One of these two teams is going to be one series away from making the quarterfinals, and I think that's a surprise to a lot of people that have watched this tournament up until this point. These are two of the weaker teams left entirely in the tournament, and even if Secret Whales, was able to pick up that win against VKS, I think Koi should have the talent and the aggression to be able to pick up a win here in a best of 3. It's all really going to come down to whether or not players like Supa and Jojo Pune can actually step up and do the things that they're supposed to do, but I imagine they will. I think it will be Koi moving on, and I think it will be Gen G qualifying for the quarterfinals out of 2-1. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that take down in the comment section below. Very curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering every day of Worlds as we have up until this point already. We've got, a couple more days of Swiss to go over before we jump into the quarterfinals, which is very exciting. Once we get to the best of 5 stage, we really are going to be breaking everything down in excruciating detail, as those are the most important games of the entire year for everybody involved, and I'm excited to get closer and closer to that stage. So if you're interested in that kind of breakdown throughout the rest of this World Championships, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all